Allow me to welcome you all, each on his or her own, inside and outside the hall. Maybe this is a session which is a little bit different from the previous sessions, other than what we had yesterday and today, from the angle that we are dealing with some issues. We are with some practitioners on the reality on the ground in Palestine and pursuing human rights cases. Maybe it's a different level of referring to the liberation from the occupation. It's a little somewhat different. I will have a sort of brief introduction within the community and historical background that has accompanied the issue of human rights in Palestine. And then I move to the panelists in this session. I start with the process. It is not accidental that President Trump, in his address on the 25th of September recently, he addressed a human rights session where the U.S. withdrew last June. This is after that the Council has taken an investigation about the killing of civilians in Gaza and the Auda return marches, and he attacked in the same session the International Criminal Court that he discovered illegitimate, and the Palestinians had referred last May, and also it had to do with killing civilians. And in September of this year, the sort of John Bolton, Trump's assistant for national issues, to bring the International Court of Justice to the judges and other measures against the judges. And the same thing about any of the friends of the U.S. being threatened, quote unquote, like Israel, that Israel has done, and any complaints referring to the friends of the U.S. He threatened the court to take measures against it. However, after the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip in 1967, Israel announced that it does not consider itself an occupying power because the West Bank and Gaza was not part of any state except from one country. But at the same time, Israel declared that it will voluntarily conform to human rights and IHL, which is also known as the law of war, seeking to protect civilians. This is why Israel tried as much as possible to refer that it's for self-defense, all the measures, because most of these civilians that they killed are human shields to protect, or they are considered terrorists where IHL does not apply. Several years after that, the Palestinians discovered the human rights and IHL, and the shock of three major Arab armies to lose was unpredictable. But after a while, not long a while, and despite this shock, the resistance started, both civilian and armed, in the West Bank and Gaza. And somebody might raise a question, how did this transition happen after the shock of defeat that was problematic, including the moral decline and the spirit of uh, resistance have become almost extinguished compared to what happened, and that all the uh, patrols existing in all the location, in all alleys. Confrontation could happen in order the stone being hurled or seeking to detain people. And the curfew in various forms was a daily event in this situation. This is in a nutshell of the general context where the human rights was quote unquote discovered and IHL as one form of resistance. There was a need to address the external world with a common language that the world could grasp and and values that they adhere to, at least. Of course, voluntarily, as I said, no one thought that uh, the seeking for human rights as a way of emancipation. It was one of the forms of tools, and under certain circumstances could be effective even from the adversary and the enemy. And just as now you have the crime and the International Criminal Court uh, and the Israeli reaction from threatening and the position of Trump, as I mentioned. And during the first decade from the occupation, the Palestinian factions around the PLO provided various services that the people under occupation, like clinics with all forms, and first aid training, and agricultural counseling, and general national mobilization with people competing of who will provide services in this. And Hamas, in its turn, later on joined in such activities. And it wasn't this the human rights in various forms, although it was aware of the national patriotic work. And for several factors, including the field resistance activity and to have specialized skills in human rights in grasping and using different bylaws that and at the time when uh, information gathering in West Bank and Gaza and documenting it in a very delicate way and seeking to confront the Israeli media mouthpieces. And maybe Al Haq was among the first organizations that started this type of work in 1979 and followed by many such institutions in the West Bank and Gaza. But with the establishment of the PA and its assuming role in Gaza first in 94 and then the West Bank at the end of 1995, it became clear that the agenda, internal agenda related to human rights, was pertinent to add in the functioning of such institutions. This was not an option, in fact, to have internal agenda, to have the credibility of its action. They could not connive from any internal violations and to maintain internal credibility, particularly that this was a nascent authority uh, which assumes together with the Israeli occupation, security coordination, and Israel, as he said in his famous sentence, that the Palestinian Authority will rule law بتسلم law بغاتس. Bagats is the court. As I pointed out, no one thought that human rights in itself shall liberate Palestine, but it was one of the mechanisms of resistance and to consolidate various other mechanisms. It is true also that the language of human rights and rights does not affect because first and foremost comes interest, but people respond to the values of justice and fairness. Be that the boycott, the BDS, that Israel makes great efforts to confront it, to abort it. And as we have seen in Trump's statement last month, it has sought to have an attack on the International Criminal Court and the Council of Human Rights. And this kind of pressure is expected to increase if the dossier of war crimes continues in future. And the Palestinian has sent to President Obama that it will not follow this dossier on the basis that John Kerry, the foreign minister, will earnestly seek to the beginning of a new political track. And for 1 year, Kerry tried but failed drastically in 2014 due to the intransigence of the Israeli government, as he said after he left office. One may say that human rights is the weapon of people who are underdogs and oppressed. But it is not the Palestinians that created this. The world was in need of it due to the woes of war. And in 20th century, and due to certain fascist movements to exterminate whole peoples, and they see now you have the return of chauvinism, populism, including Israel and the United States. And now Trump is seeking to undermine many of the foundations of international accords in an unprecedented thuggishness of them. And now it becomes clear, at least, that many countries shall resist this goal. And within this context, it seems that the Palestinians have no choice other than resistance, regardless of what form it will take, including adhering to values of justice and human rights and steadfastness on the ground. And there is no other option. And in order to have an analytical thing that people having to do with emancipation from occupation, we see for practitioners in order to shed light on internal aspects as well as external that have to do with the liberation. And we start with Fatih Azam. There is a lot written on Fatih. He was the previous director of Al Haq, but he was active in Muwatin at the AUB in Beirut, and regional representatives of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. Why High Commissioner? They call it that. High, has many things. It reminds of the High Commissioner and the head of in Cairo. He was also the head of the Ford Foundation and director of Al Haq previously. So the floor is his.
Okay, is it working now? But I wanted to talk about, with regard to the human rights in the framework of liberation from the occupation, is to go back to some of the fundamentals, and to see where does the human rights lie in the international priorities, um, in order to assess the status of or importance of human rights on the international level. Recently, we see a lot of criticisms or people who are trying to undermine or even question the jurisdiction or authority of human rights. I think that I am with the critical thinking about this. Critical thinking is good because we see what we did and what we failed to do and so on. However, we see that many of the criticisms come as superficial binaries. They just take one part of the story out of proportion and make a big thing out of it. Some of these binaries that we talk about, and I am against, are binaries. They stand such as the law vs politics. It seems from this binary that as if law does not rely on the politics and the other way around. And also, other binaries, such as the rights of the individual vs the rights of the group. How can we know what the group wants? Why should the individual always melt under the desire of the public? Also, the national sovereignty vs globalization. So all of these binaries. Today, it is impossible for any region in the world to live as an isolated place. Today we have become, of course, a global village. That's why we must understand the current reality and to avoid such false binaries, if you may. This also is related to the following, that if we look at the cultural specificity and national sovereignty, it seems as if some people think that they do not want to learn from anyone else. No, this is not true. That's why we must avoid making mistakes. A part of the problem behind these false binaries is that there is sometimes an inconsistency between ethics, principles, values, what have you. Some people go to study about the principles of human rights from the moral and ethical points of view, or the human rights in the legal manner. Some people look at it just as a law and don't really take human rights or the human into considerations. Some people even go as far as saying that lawyers have hijacked human rights. Or some people talk about politics. They say human rights don't even exist. It's all politics. That the politicians use human rights to hit our heads with sticks. In reality, human rights are all of these components together. They are ethical, moral, political and legal system, which are interrelated. Among the things that I would like to mention is the following. The ethical system of human rights is embodied in a number of things, of values since early on, such as do not thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not kill, and so on. This was within the framework of the society, the religion, and what have you. However, when this is put or placed in the framework of a law, they become rights. Who puts that in a legal framework? The political party does. And human rights conventions, I see them as nothing holy, not like a holy book. They are just a political negotiation between country representatives. It took the leaders 18 years to formulate and agree on the two international covenants. In, because of the it took them a lot of time until they came with the two covenants: the covenant for political, economic, and social, and the other covenant. And later, dozens of countries joined, so two covenants became in effect. Human rights became legal after that. Um, Legal rights that one can assume. In the case of countries that have ratified these laws, the citizens can go and resort to international mechanisms that will oblige states to conform. Now, the politicians who agreed to formulate these legal stipulations and provisions came up with that. 1966 was an important year when the two international covenants were formulated. However, they made sure that there won't be a compulsory mechanism of implementation. They just stuck to naming, shaming, and the submitting of reports and so on. Therefore, in all these covenants, they put committees or formulated committees that can help countries adhere and perform their obligations related to human rights. The ethical values in legal texts, were there, but nothing was compulsory in the human rights thing. Up until we reached the International Criminal Court in 2004, and of course the Rome Statute discusses that. These are the three paradigms that work together. It would either be legal criticisms or political criticisms because of the weakness of the law in many countries. For example, after being accessed in international, or after the accession of countries in international conventions, a country must change its laws to adhere to international conventions. Okay, what was I saying? All right. So the modification of legislations. As for the third phase, it is when you have a committee that or whose function is to request from all relevant parties to provide and submit reports. So politicians sometimes maybe didn't know what will happen after they joined the different conventions, but the politicians many times opened the chance for cooperation between states. And that is a great opportunity for enforcing human rights in different countries, including Palestine. I do not want to prolong, but yeah, if you can give me a few more minutes. Okay, then in that case, I will not delve into that. Now, within the mechanisms of implementing human rights, we don't only have conventions. I talked about the two international covenants, but after that, there was a series of agreements and conventions which had committees which looked into each of the implementation elements. But all of this opened the chance for public debate and discussion about this. These covenants all emanate from UN conventions. The National Assembly of the UN had started and initiated that, and then in 2005 or 2006, they became the Human Rights Commission, or established the Human Rights Commission. We have two types of things: a political decision related to, or decisions related to human rights, where there is ratification by states, and there is also a political body related to human rights, which has 47 members. Each member is a representative of different countries based on the geographic blocks or areas within the UN. The countries speak together through their representatives. Their basis is human rights. It's not political, but we know that when they are representatives and appointed for such, they are probably politicians as well. But they are obliged many times to take strong or serious decisions. There are, of course, laws against punishment or torture or other things, laws against torture, and so on. However, there are people who represent themselves. They are not political representatives per se. They actually work within a framework which is far away from the political level. And such credible persons also submit reports to the United Nations Human Rights Commission with regard to the violations that take place. I wanted to note these points because there is like a kind of interaction between the law and human rights and politics. The more we are isolated from the political level, the more there could be a balanced approach with regard to human rights. However, the more the thing is closer to the political level, you see a wrestling between countries, if you may, where countries are using human rights to smash or try to attack other countries. And we have seen many cases of this under the UN Human Rights Commission. In my opinion, there are 3 or 4 important factors. Yes. First, the ethical dimension of struggle. We are doing struggle in order to become liberated from the occupation. But why do we want to become liberated? Do we want to be liberated in order to substitute a foreign occupation with a local occupation which does the same practices? Human rights conventions and agreements provide a basis for a good relationship between citizens and the government in the case of liberation. In order to avoid the existence of oppression. This is quite a quite deep subject. Human rights is not a political thing. However, as Said Zaidani or Zidane said yesterday, the liberalism of equality or based on equality is important because it is with democracy against dictatorship. It is with the rights of um, individuals and also groups and marginalized societies and segments. However, within all that framework, some people think that when we talk about human rights, we're only talking about political issues or civil issues. No, some of it has to do with also employment, equal employment, and the right to live, and many other aspects that we all know very well. So every so every political faction, from the far right to the far left, um, claims to uphold human rights, but in order to really adhere to human rights, one parties should have a real willingness to implement human rights, not just to claim. Many people use human rights in order to reach the climax of power and authority. Therefore, um, it is very important to be ethical in terms of the struggle and values with regard to human rights. Another point is this: human rights opens several doors, if you may, into becoming liberated from the occupation, such as international panels and bodies, and submitting reports to special rapporteurs who we can invite and give information. We can talk with different concerned and relevant committees. We still do not have a political mechanism to do that. Um, I have looked into the procedures of the Human Rights Commission and saw that the number of bodies which submitted reports to the Human Rights Commission was 3 times more in the second period compared to the first period. This means a good development in this direction. The third point, and then George is pressing me a bit. Okay. The third point is or constitutes a very important framework for international solidarity and collective work on the whole global level into becoming liberated for the future. Today, we see good results from this on the ground. We see a great increase in international solidarity with the Palestinian cause, including in the United States of America, on the popular levels as well. It is way more than before. I don't want to say that this is because of human rights only, but human rights provides us with a very good tool to enhance international solidarity to become liberated, or for Palestinians to become liberated from occupation. This is a mutual language with all over the world, but at the same time, it gives us a responsibility to also support the liberation of many other peoples across the world. So, for example, there are Palestinian groups in the United States which are participating in the campaigns of other oppressed persons, such as Black Lives Matter and the indigenous peoples' struggle for liberation. So Palestinians in different countries are also supporting the liberation of other oppressed persons. That's why the international solidarity aspect is very important. The fourth aspect is the legal struggle in the courts and so on. This is quite tough, I have to say. and the true struggle. For example, through the ICC to Shahwan and Al Haq, the Al Haq organization has been involved in this with the International Criminal Court. I don't remember when was the first time they submitted reports and where they asked from the Attorney General of the ICC to start investigating into violations. Um, so under with regard to general jurisdictions, what have you, the legal struggle, there were frivolous cases, so-called frivolous cases by some. What can we do in the future? First of all, to think about human rights as one of the tools for liberation. Are you either you work? No, some people think that either you work as human rights or politics. No, what we need are popular movements that struggle for human rights, politics, legal, and cultural levels. You know, several people who are involved in more than one aspect on the legal level, on the political level, on the media level, on the artistic level. There is also a great battle being waged, even on the level of health. In the field of health, we also see Israeli trials and attempts to conquer. That's why we must never exclude any field from this, or to use some of the false binaries, superficial binaries that make no sense. No, we must encompass everything altogether. Finally, and as an example of this, I can mention the BDS, Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement. The BDS has human rights as its objective. Freedom from the occupation, equality between all citizens, and the right of return of refugees. All of these are human rights, right? So the BDS is also a social movement whose trait is that it is non-central or decentralized. Every person can understand the tenets of BDS and start doing campaigns all over the world. It is decentralized, and this is a very good example of the social mobilization that can take place. This shouldn't be on the account of other mobilizations or initiatives. No, all of them can work together in a comprehensive manner. I would like to stop now. I mean, I think I've covered the main subjects. Thank you very much, Mr. Fatah Azzam. We can go back to these subjects during the discussion. Now we move to Dr. Ammar Dweck. As you know very well, there is an echo, by the way. Thank you. Thank you. He is the head of the Palestinian Independent Commission for Human Rights. He is also a lawyer and has a PhD in management and social politics. General Director of the Independent Commission for Human Rights. He holds a PhD in social policy and management from Brandeis University. He will talk today about the international law as a national liberation tool. Please go ahead. Thank you, Dr. George. Thanks to the organizers of this conference. I used a question mark in the subject. It's called International Law as a National Liberation Tool with a question mark. So in the Palestinian
national discourse. Today we are talking with a language that specifies international legitimacy. Even Hamas movement is using that. If we look at the new document of Hamas, we see that even Hamas is mentioning the international law to justify its positions. For example, the Hamas movement says that the illegitimacy of Israel is because, or that Israel is illegitimate because it goes against international law, and that therefore declaration is illegal. So the Hamas movement is using that language as well. They also used human rights principles, international law. In Hamas documents, they're saying, for example, that Oslo Accords are unacceptable because it is against international law, and that settlements are against international law, and the right of self uh, self declaration, um, and the liberation of Palestine. So that they're also mentioning protocols of the elders of Zion and so on in their laws. So the Hamas movement has started using more of national rhetoric in the previous or long ago, but today we see that they are using human rights language as a cornerstone for liberating from the occupation. For example, Hamas. I heard a Hamas official saying that we and Fatah were going through the armed struggle, but now we are going towards state establishment in accordance with human rights and standing in the face of the occupation. And the Palestinian president also used legal language when Trump declared Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. The president of Palestine mentioned that this violates human rights, and he mentions the violations, he mentioned the conventions that Trump violated when he declared Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. So this language of international law brings us to the following point. Is it good to keep referring to international law or no? Or not in our mission for becoming liberated from the occupation? And are we as Palestinians benefiting from the human rights references or not? And also, when we learn from the experience of other national liberation movements throughout the world. So this over mentioning of international conventions has been seen quite clearly through the speeches of the president and so on. But it shows that the Palestinian leadership sees the international law as an important and main tool in resisting against the occupation. I would like to refer today that in the past days there were many absolute or negative comments about human rights, that they support colonization and so on. Different people mentioned various comments. I would like to note the following. One, human rights has become the mutual global language. It is a language that all the world understands today in standing against injustices, and it guides the behavior of countries. There is no country in the world that claims to violate human rights. Today, Putin in Syria says that what he is doing in Syria goes hand in hand with human rights. Even Trump is saying that what he is doing is in accordance with international human rights law. So even the Hamas movement is saying that they understand human rights and they are applying it. Therefore, since there is a joint language, and no one is claiming that he is violating human rights, this shows that human rights could be confused sometimes or misinterpreted, and human rights has different frameworks that allow you to try to manipulate that for your political rights, not just uh, from one party. Therefore, we as Palestinians have seen that human rights can definitely be used to promote our liberation orientation or objective. However, at the same time, Israel claims that Palestinians are violating human rights. You see what I mean to say, and they are saying that Palestinians are violating the international law for combating terrorism, and they're using and they are claiming that Palestinians are violating human rights internally. This has been recent, and the UN. Um, there has been a spy of Israelis who he is a Palestinian, and he was speaking in the UN, attacking the Palestinians and the Palestinian leadership and country. So they used that spy to try to attack Palestine in the UN. So the Hamas movement. Yeah, so technically, the Rome Statute can even be used against us, and they can claim that Palestine has perpetrated war crimes. But this means that the different countries can use human rights against each other. You see, um, some people were talking about the dark side of international law or the dark side of rights. I think that the international law combines between two things. One, that it reflects the interests and balances of superpowers, and two, it reflects a real desire for stability around the world and mutual coexistence, as well as global peace. Global peace can only be achieved through rights and justice. So these two elements are there in international law. One, hegemony, and two, the desire for justice and peace around the world. The best example of this is what is happening in the Palestinian cause. For example, the human rights, or so-called, created the state of Israel, even though it was a colonization. So this shows that the superpowers wanted Israel to exist, but at the same time, the different international humanitarian laws were emphasizing the right of Palestinian people to live in dignity, and there in the international law there are many clauses talking against occupation, but at the same time talking against terrorism. For example, the drones that decide that someone is a terrorist and they kill him in an extrajudicial manner is being justified. Or if someone is suspected to be a terrorist and then they falsely come and close his bank account and take his property without even a court case, is illegal. The international law has been, in a way, hypocritical, if you may, if in this thing. Um, Also, colonization. Many colonizing countries misused these laws, but at the same time, they wanted to give independence to the peoples of the world. So, for example, there was the law of 1960, which declared that colonization is illegal and against the main principles for human rights. But at the same time, um, they didn't mention the accountability of occupying forces or powers. So from one side, they were saying, we give you the right of being liberated from the occupation, but at the same time, they support occupations. So we as Palestinians must understand these two orientations. We shouldn't be overly romantical, if you may, but at the same time, we shouldn't be disappointed or negative, disillusioned about that. No, we must take a balanced approach. In the mid 70s, we saw several developments happening. For example, many anti-colonialist movements started uh, focusing more on human rights on various levels or in varying degrees from place to another. There was also the utilization of human rights by occupying forces themselves, claiming that um, that the locals were doing human rights violations and what have you. However, what we can conclude from the experiences of countries which were liberated from the occupation are that they have three main conditions before being liberated. One, the first condition was that there was an international acknowledgement or recognition of the right of these people to gain liberation and independence. It was not only the right to self declaration, but also there were other more complex cases like the Kurds. You must have an international recognition about your right to self declaration. So the parties or groups which received that right became liberated, and the ones and the opposite is true. In other words, and so and two is mobilization, which many times led to many lots of bloodshed, like in Algeria, and in other cases there was no need for bloodshed. Number three is to have the superpowers themselves lose the desire to occupy, such as in the case with France in Algeria. So these three conditions must be well understood when we talk about using international law to face and counter occupation. There must be international recognition, mobilization, and, as I said, that the superpowers would be with us. However, the problem with Palestine is that the superpowers are in a way against us. Um, Today, it seems that the international law is the main agenda for liberation. The PLO has resorted to the General Assembly and made agreements and coalitions with many world countries since the 70s, and the result of that was a large number of international conventions, more than 200 decisions or conventions of the General Assembly, more than 400 resolutions of the General Assembly, and also countless decisions of the Human Rights Commission, the establishment of UNRWA, the establishment of the special rapporteur for the occupied territories, and also the establishment of different fact-finding committees in the country, or to explore the violations in the country, as well as many mechanisms which uh, affirm the rights of the Palestinian people. So, as a result of all this mobilization, the right of the Palestinian people to self declaration and the illegitimacy of Israeli measures and procedures on the ground became quite clear in the international system or the international law. The International Court of Justice has understood this very well, fortunately. And so, many times we have an obsession to talk about our rights and so on. However, but I think that our rights or our right to the land has already been proven in the international law. So there is also large a lot of literature that covers this subject. However, there has been some uh, confusion in the international frameworks that we have in order to move forward. So today, some people can easily prove that we are now being colonized. Colonization is proven very well. Just like what was mentioned by the special rapporteur, today Israel, it has been proven that Israel is a colonization and an illegal occupation. Now we have officially entered the apartheid phase. It is illegitimate, it is illegal and racist. All of these frameworks became quite confusing in our work mechanisms. Therefore, on the Palestinian level, it became important to specify what we want exactly. Do we want to deal with apartheid and ask for equality, as in the case in South Africa, one man, one vote? Do we want that, or do we want self-declaration? So, yeah, the Palestinian state. Would that also include the Palestinians of 1948? Do they have the same right and mechanism? Do we want to only focus on the fact that it is an illegitimate occupation, like Michael Link said, and to go to the international courts and ask for legitimacy, like in the case, or as in the case of Namibia, or do we need to go to the International Court of Justice to tell them that Israel has become an apartheid state and different procedures must be taken to stand against us? I think that this discussion has not taken place in Palestine until today. Uh, but I think that we are, in a way, inconsistent in this. Therefore, we must specify what we want exactly. We can also specify certain frameworks of of our own. Maybe as Palestinians, we can articulate and build what we want exactly. Um, why do we need to stick to the old frameworks such as colonization, occupation, and so on? And therefore, we as Palestinians must specify what we want exactly, and afterwards, we should take it to the extreme, to take it all the way until the end. So, in this framework, I would like to talk about the strategic framework of the Palestinian level. We want international. It seems that we are confused. Some people want to go to the criminal court, but want negotiations at the same time. You should specify: do you want A or B? If you come and say, you cannot technically come and say that settlements are a war crime, and at the same time go and negotiate. That in itself is an oxymoron in a way, because if we come and say this is a war crime and still talk with Israel, then Israel can come and say, "Hey, I'm building occupation. I'm building the settlements in areas that we can use for negotiation." So we are having a weak position Another thing, another thing is that there is an international language of civil society. In this context, we can do mobilization. So sometimes there is the illegality of some things, such as armed conflict or armed struggle, is a big mistake. But today it become even more legitimate after Palestine becoming a non-member state. Armed struggle became much more legitimate, where a country can defend itself. It is no longer seen as in the past. Uh, Armed struggle is legitimate, definitely. And at the same time, the Palestinian national struggle should orient towards non-violence, and should be far-reaching. Also, what has been happening in Gaza is that what is legal globally, because there has been a mobilization of 1948 Palestinians on different levels. Therefore, what I want to say is that as Palestinians, we must specify our vision um, within a specific framework. Um, Another thing is that our struggle and national movement must go hand in hand with the general international mood or the general mood of the international civil society. And another thing is that as Palestinians, we have come to use human rights excessively to the world. We must also respect human rights internally as well, in order to make sure that we are not hypocrites. And unfortunately, we do have some hypocrisy. Sometimes we use human rights just to face or counter the occupation, but our human rights profile is becoming worse, unfortunately, on the internal level. Therefore, we must be keen on that and uphold human rights at all levels internally, and to use or utilize human rights to remove or no, enhance, sorry, the rights of the Palestinian people. Thank you. I thought it was only 20 minutes. I took 15 minutes. I was given 15. No, you spoke more, she says. I think I actually took 25 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Usually I am lenient. I'm not good in guillotining. We will return to the Q&A. But the point of options is an important point. But one of the problematics that decisions are taken. Because of the paralysis, which is a need to discuss things. We move to Sahar Francis. She's Director General of Damir for support of detainees, and she's a specialized lawyer on issues of human rights. And her expert is also in consulting and representing. She will speak about the detainee status and legal defense. So the floor is hers. Good evening. Thanks for inviting me to have this presentation in this conference. I believe that the issue of political prisoners is one of the living models of theories and the discussion that we addressed in the last 2 days about the tension about IHL and international law, which is the political situation, and all the questions that have been raised. Do we live in an apartheid or colonialism or settler or illegal occupation? Because the status of the detainees is affected and affects with all these factors. Utilizing the issue of detention as a form of oppression and hegemony did not start in 67. The colonizing Israeli thing have evoked since 1948 and the Nakba. There were detentions, particularly between 48 and 49. And unfortunately, there aren't lots of literature, but there are numbers for, for the experience of detention in 48. If we compare the military rule and the utilization of the law in order to have hegemony and the emergency regulations that the occupation is still declared and utilizes the British emergency rules, and then there was issuing the combating terrorism with all the emergency after 67 moved to the occupied West Bank and Gaza, which is to have the military orders issued, but it depended mostly on rephrasing the emergency regulations, and this was the backbone for control in all the civil political aspects of in all of Palestine, within Israel and the West Bank and the OPT. Coming back to the issue of the detainees and the status which the occupation has given, I don't want to refer to all the history because there are sort of detailed aspects that we to see the development. Today, the definition is like between parentheses is a terrorist when in fact it is a political detainee. So, or the military orders that apply on this group of detainees that have special rights that differentiate with the criminal detainees and the Israeli issues who are detained due to that are based on ideological foundations. The essential aspect is not in act when we say security detainee is only the people who used arms or cause injury or killing. Or, the boy which held stones, and he is subject to the same security standards. But the central thing, it is ideology, that it is which is resistance to occupation. So this is how you have the specificity in definition. So it was thing that was monolithic in order to exclude and the IHL in a selective way according to its interests. And maybe, or rather, if we look into the experience of those who are in 1948, it was Israeli, so there wasn't much usage of international except in later years. In the 60s, there wasn't big focus on international bylaws or courts. later after 67, there was non-recognition of the applicability of international bylaws, and the military orders were the backbone of legislation. Uh, we should know that the occupation was trying constantly to analyze international thing, and I want to give some examples. I will build it from the application part in through the 2 decades I was involved in this, which has to do with cases raised in front of the military court or the Supreme Court, which had the final say. That has set up the main framework for how to deal with the Palestinian detainees, creating the concept of an illegitimate fighter. This exists only under Israeli occupation. The way this framework developed was during the Lebanese war, when there was the Israeli Lebanese people who were kidnapped, who they claimed was Ron Arad, the Israeli pilot who disappeared during the Lebanese war. So, and Abdul Karim Abed and Mustafa Dirani, who were detained for 10 years, administrative detention. Every 6 months they used to renew the administrative. After 10 years, the Israeli court, I cannot legally continue justification on the basis of administrative to get information because they became hostages. You are utilizing these people in order to get information on Ron Arad, and they left a legal loophole in order to develop the illegitimate fighter in 2000, when the Knesset defined to an illegitimate thing anybody who belong to terrorist organizations, and you have hundreds of parties that are there. It's enough to be a member. It is not required only you are a terrorist. If you are a member of and so you are hostile against Israel, so therefore you are an illegitimate thing that you can be detained endlessly. And the difference is that there is no time limit, which is 6 months. That it is continuous. It's a sort of automatic. Every 6 months, the judge decides to keep renewing this, and this was utilized. Dirani and Ahmed were released in a deal with Hezbollah, but it was used in 2008 in Gaza. During the war of Gaza, they should have been released during the first war on Gaza, but they were defined as illegitimate fighters, and people stayed 7-8 months after the war. This is a model how the occupation adapts and explains IHL based on its interests and its schemes. I should not mention that within the context of there are important junctures, Carrefour, and the period before Oslo, and I care the issue of ending occupation as part of liberation. If we consider that the political detainees are part of the national movement, so they have to do with self-determination. So we assume that any end to the apartheid colonization, that all the detainees should be unconditionally dismissed. released. If we take the tools which was used to defend their rights before Oslo, that it depends on the emancipation and the continuation of the struggle before and after detention, to have to do with strikes and collective actions as a movement. This is inseparable from the national movement outside in order to struggle within the prisons. That most of the detainees today, they know exactly more than I do to take a paper and a pen and a mattress and books. Until now, contact is banned. When I started work, where even the right to get on a telephone to call the family. Without further ado, the essence was in the move of the detainees that they lead and organize, and not constantly to resort to local courts, whether it is central court, Atirat Asir, which is the appeals by prisoners or major cases for collective action. There are still rulings like Sajadiye and Amli concerning administrative detention, but this was not the basis. In Oslo, in the first, there was not a single mention of the detainees in the first accord, and this agitated the street, and there was a backlash where you have in Taba they mentioned, but there were conditions attached to it, and how we see that the occupation has separated the issue from liberation and from the national plan, and with good intentions we will release detainees, and there was a fragmentation for people who are senior citizens, people who have blood on their hand, and models of detainees to remind us the importance of struggle in order to release all women detainees except 4 women at the time, and more than 120 sit-in happens, closing the sections for 17 months. Either we all leave or no one leaves, and the occupation succumbed, and all the prisoners were. But this was not seriously followed up. We started to see backlash reflecting with the political developments that happened on the ground to separate it from the decline of the struggle of detainees. And there were legal strategies that developed after Oslo within the military courts and within the context of the level of the detainees and dealing with them, and the legal intervention that happened in the military courts. The deals were always there. It was this is not something that developed mostly after Oslo. To reach deals, we did not take into consideration this new kind of political action and how it had to revise the same military system for detention. We remained on the same path that we are under occupation, like the issue of moving from Area A, and the Palestinian Authority is supposed to be there. So, with all right, this is not our responsibility, but the political echelons that there comes a hot pursuit, hot pursuit that you can detain anybody within the areas A. And this has been ongoing on the political life. All the detention that occurred with the legislative council members, the political activists, and people defending human rights, and university students, and thousands of detainees who continued being detained in 2002, where there were 12,000. Once again, I want to link between 1948 and 67. Let's not forget that even the detainees within Oslo and sort of they left the people from Jerusalem, and where there were discussions, and so far you have more than 34 detainees from pre-1993 Oslo. They must have been released with the. When was the difference in 2000, 2007 that the last bunch led to put the within this group? What is happening now is a legal development of Israeli criminal law. The apartheid system is that within the criminal law in Israel that is supposed to apply on all in an equal manner. There is a difference if you are detained along ideological Palestinian detainee or an Israeli in terms of procedure. There is a segregation in dealing. Uh, like the issue who killed Rabin, that he has a life sentence, but he was allowed to marry and establish a family and to have sort of, to have a transplant of a baby in prison. Until now, there is a Palestinian who has not been given to have his semen planted or either direct kind of other than Walid Daqqa, the issue of education. You remember in 2012, the relatively successful general strike, food strike, education in universities. They made an appeal to the Supreme Court before the strike occurred. So the prison authorities said it is not part of the issue that you made an appeal. Let's see what the Supreme Court will rule. And after 2 years, it ruled that the right of education is a privilege that we are not obliged to respond to. And it had to do with the amount of chicken and meat that they take more than the criminals. So therefore, in return, they are not supposed to learn because they eat more meat and chicken. So it means that they have to be deprived from university education. Touche. In military courts, they took all the details for the procedures that have to do with the relevant data that they took from the criminal laws. And there is a differentiation, even after the amendments that happened, that the children was in 18 until in 2012. They raised it to 18 years. And and from 67 until 2004, there were normal soldiers who issued rulings that, but then in 2004, three judges have to be there and not to provide the background for just trials. And when you allow It's okay. Until now, torture and that the occupation is proud that in 1999, in September, the issue was issued in order to ban torture, but until now there is a loophole which is used when it is necessary, when it's a force majeure to use violence in order to get information, it is allowed to exercise torture. And 99% of the dossiers are built on the confessions of the detainees. There are a number of cases where the occupation in all of these years utilized the law in a selective uh, manner, and also how principles from the international criminal law, when it fits them. The case of Ahmed Saadat, and there was a charge sheet which was part of killing the tourism minister, Gandhi or Saevi. There wasn't a single proof that Ahmed Saadat, in giving orders or implementation, with anything having to do with the operation. But at the end of the day, he decided to boycott, and he did not allow the lawyers. We used to sit just to listen to witnesses, and then they condemned it. Svileka, the judge, he used a case from Yugoslavia president, that the presidents or heads of organizations core, for the first time, I see that they are basing themselves on international, like Nadir Sadaqa, who is a Nablus guy, who took the same position, that I'm a fighter and you are not allowed. I have to be a prisoner of war. I should be treated as a prisoner of war. And all cases was that I have the status, and this was rejected. And he was condemned that, and he has 3 life sentences until today. This has to do with how we, in a deviant way, use the court. Thank you, Sahar. We move to Shawan Jabareen, Director General of Al-Haq and Deputy Director of the International Federation of Human Rights. Mr. Shawan Jabareen, they faced a very fierce campaign from Israeli and Zionist circles, particularly because they deal with issues described as crimes of war. And we hope that Al-Haq will be utilized. He will address the social economic things during the period of national liberation. The floor is yours. Thank you for Muwatin for organizing this meeting, and I want to thank the translators that they are still in full force. And I want to take bullet points. I'm not in an academic and not referring to the details of this item or that item, but to have things that to raise, to bring pieces together. I think there are 2 problems on the issue of human rights and how people view it. There are 2 menaces. One is romantic, that human rights, it was by that things will go and be implemented. This is romance, where you have something which is totally negating that and dismissing things, and that it is not connected with the political attitude. Uh, it is like phrases that are on the shelf. They are meaningless in terms of application and action. But we cannot go in front of oppression that I am fighting in the court, in the street, in various forums. When you have a vote, I believe that people put all their wrath on a basic issue that they cannot pick up, that it's not applied. It's not with the text, but it is with implementation. But without implementation, it's meaningless. But it needs, the reason to have mechanisms and organizing. The IHL is also developed. Historically, we cannot exclude it the way it was 2 centuries ago, that the limitations that pursuing manners and this is also is developing. The idea of immunity for president, they consider it one of the foundations. This has been broken with the International Criminal Court. This is a development, even in issues that are taboo, or there is also a certain dismantling and alteration in the laws that develop all the time. So it has to do with the discussion in front of the General Assembly, and it has to do with academic and coming from society, and not other than the rapporteurs. And part of the explanations and positions and points of view, they are very progressive, dynamic. So it is worth to look at this from such an angle. But the other point, if somebody thinks that the international law in itself will liberate the country, this is romantic. There are balances, there are interests. It's a complex situation. The role of other countries is standing behind a policy or otherwise. Also, when it was held, that what was lacking, two important points: the human rights and international law. There wasn't a single word related to commitments or to occupation. When they signed these accords, they said, we did a mistake about the settlement and in this and that, all the loopholes. They said, we said it 25 years ago, but they did not take into consideration of certain issues the solution where we could not have been this issue. We could have aborted the possibility of having so many hurdles. They told in official letters to Arafat that this Article 7 and 8 and 47 from Geneva that does not give you the right, even if you that what is included in Geneva fourth item. But this is a complex. We warned Arafat about this in writing, as al-haq. And when you speak about social, political, economic thing, it's the responsibility of a state. We actually do not have. We have only a virtual state by name, but on the ground there is no state with borders, with sovereignty. We work in order to enhance. What are the separating borders and political and economic rights that Palestine accepted? What even with the limitation of the PA and its mandate on the ground, particularly if I deal that economic, social rights are linked with the issue of natural resources and there is no sovereignty over natural resources, which is the basic uh, right of having the right of living, and are these formalistic commitments, or there are margins? I'm still under occupation. What is the responsibility of occupation over the political, cultural, economic issues, and how such commitments emanate from? It has to do also with IHL. When they present a report, they bluntly said that the occupation is in charge because it is the actual ruler. So it's responsibility of the prosperity of the population and the different rights, political, economic. So it became responsible, but in official report that we have there are no strings attached to our authority, and this does not apply on the West Bank and Gaza, where you have only the humanitarian law. Uh, in order to avoid the concept of international human rights. Uh, so they were evading the main issue, that the humanitarian thing does not have any teeth or nails, except to the agreement on torture and collective genocide, where you can follow up in court when this happened. So all countries should pursue and punish. It should be without impunity in the specialization outside the geographical framework. What remains is the ethical aspects concerning political and social and economic rights. It has to do that since the establishment in history of the package legislating, there were two phases. There was a sort of divergence between the socialist system and the capitalist. The capitalist regime gave a great weight, attached great weight to political thing, because it doesn't have direct responsibilities. It doesn't cost anything. It regulates and legislates and makes sure that there are safeguards for proper and freedom of expression. But the other issue is positive responsibilities, which means you have to make sure that people get an appropriate way for accommodation, and to have proper nutrition and clothing and water and all the basic requirements for livelihood. You don't leave the thing to the companies or otherwise, where there is responsibility. Therefore, the socialist aspect, they say that we secure, and the other say you are violating rights. So there is divergence. There wouldn't be life with dignity without a proper accommodation and proper treatment, respectable, and the right to express, and proper education. Even separating is closer to a political issue, and responding for a divergence in the international community, rather than be something realistic that is justifiable. It crisscrosses, and it's a complex issue. But then the committee which was established for economic and social rights, it has to do with respect, protection, as the resources of the state is there. I do not want to delve too much in schematic thing having to do with economic and social rights, but I want to link it with the actual thing that you became beggars in the simple language while being deprived from using your natural resources. So, so they become responsible. The occupation is not costing him anything, and countries are sort of contributing to, and this becomes irreversible. That when you take from the natural resources, this affects the further generations in future over this issue. Where do I fit within this? And to make it rights as part of the national liberation from the essential legal, which is the prosperity of the population, and to struggle from internal courts within my courts over the level, for example, of the International Court of Justice, which has to do with the rights of economic, so according to the consultative committees, and to deal with natural resources. I take 6, 7 cases of the right of the Palestinian people over its natural, to have sovereignty over its natural, when they are deprived from this and the occupation, because the Fourth Geneva Convention has to do, which is administrative, temporary, ad hoc, a kind of interest that has to do with the issue of the occupation, if it wants to legitimize. So the prosperity of the occupied areas, it is essential for the occupying power. So maybe you can argue about this from the legal point of view, to use it in this direction, the prosperity according to the Fourth Geneva Convention, and the natural resources and sovereignty over people in this aspect, and the way it reflects to the occupied and the population that needs to be protected. Otherwise, it is formalistic. But in my opinion, the authority has assumed a responsibility bigger than its size, and it has comforted the occupation and carried a higher burden. So some will say it is to consolidate, but people are telling, watch out for a basic issues. Where are the dividing lines? And on some point, the committee of the accord, which assumes that we are a state, so we have responsibilities to shoulder responsibilities towards the senior citizens, the schools, and social welfare, and they will deal as if the occupation has withered away. So how can you use your funds through? The basic issue is the issue of the budgets. Does it undermine such rights? Where is its importance within the phase of national liberation, and where you have unemployment, which is affecting the immigration of young people, and the punishment over the sanctions on Gaza that affect a lot of the people within your authority and the state and the future and national liberation and what have you. Today, there is a term which is said, maybe the occupation phase was better. We could go to the job market or to have our nutrition assured. I think this is a dangerous approach. Is the authority concerning the rights of economic, social, and cultural. Is this what's requested? Does it take into consideration that a society, when you have a full generation without providing job opportunities, you will have very serious losses? The other aspect has to do with the companies and globalization over this issue. I don't want to the theoretical thing how companies interferes with the. I was thinking only 2 minutes is remaining. The companies is a basic issue on this, and according to international law, something which is uh, growing up, other than the orientation directions for the UN about the companies that should honor the rights of people, try to have an international accord, because the companies became somewhat like countries. They have grown uh, greatly, and its violation on the ground has been severely uh, increased. Now they have a diplomatic a course for companies in pressuring and in manipulating. You have 3 minutes, so I should. It's confusing. I have to focus more on. In my opinion, the issue is worth looking, probing into, and in terms of the resilience of the people, and to have more faith in the future and defending the resources of the country. Thus, the IHL represents a jumping board to defend. I believe in this, where there is a wide range that we can struggle. Although I already mentioned that those who think the international law will be sufficient to liberate. Otherwise, but I believe in a session where I'm not personally convinced that there is a wide range that we did not manage through a strategic plan to take that course, diplomatic, political, legal, and the rights to use all the resources and take all elements into consideration. When we deal with companies, we are into a jungle. Why that working in settlements, which means they are engaged in criminal actions. The International Court deals with persons. It has no authority over the companies, but they do violations also and commit crimes, these companies. If there is a case where the company is involved in, and like you have a war crime or crime against humanity, we may think about it in this respect. So the discussion is to criminalize, even if it is the companies, that is the day where they are pillaging natural resources. Israeli companies and international and even Arab companies. But as an example, the lack of clarity and strategy, it leads in a mess for the authority, and it affects Heidelberg, a German company. Heidelberg, no, it's in Sulfate Quarry. We follow with them, and today the banks are withdrawing their shares because they are working in sulfate. The biggest Swedish bank, Nordea, has withdrawn from the company. The PA has made a contract to have a cement factory to the east of Bethlehem. So the Palestinian, the investment company, and when we were speaking this in Norway, and companies and withdraw does not affect you as a Palestinian. So they told them that they would provide job opportunities in the cement factory. So we have reached to this kind of interrelatedness. The issue is long if we speak about the other internal law. But last point, not least, even our basic law says that the economic pattern for us is the free market economy. And I don't know how under the face of freedom, what is the free market? Does a certain company monopolizes the situation of people, which means we are sucking the blood of people. Where do we stand according to this particular phase of culture? This is just throwing points, and I hope that the discussion will develop the thing in a clearer way. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Shahwan. Shahwan. Just a small comment. Mr. Shahwan was talking about some of the perpetrated mistakes. For example, the with regard to the Oslo Accords and the settlements. I think the proof of that is that the Palestinian side asked to stop the settlements in the Oslo Accords. It has been written that the Palestinians asked Israel to stop the settlements during the Oslo Accords. However, the Palestinians did not want to stop the negotiations because of the settlement. That was a major issue. This was not a mistake, it was a decision. It also is related to today, but this is another independent subject. Let us now open the chance for questions. Dr. Bassem? Thanks to the four speakers. I have a question which I prefer that the first two speakers would answer. Fatah Hazam and Ammar Dwek. To the two. Success in developing a reasonable strategy towards the world in accordance with human rights principles and hand in hand with international law would necessitate the posing of a very important question on the Palestinian level. In the two formulas, armed conflict and negotiations, there was no success for Palestinians in the two forms or phases. However, these two phases were probably easier than the third one, in which we now see a great challenge. My question is as follows: what do we need to do in order to create a strong Palestinian strategy to gain better success and to have a strategy for enhancement and development and not collapse? Because what I heard so far is huge problems that are quite worrying, such as the binaries and different misconceptions and inconsistencies. The question is, in this state of non clarity, is this strategy does this strategy need to be promoted amidst a time when there is a lot of resistance internally? Hi, hello, doctor, and thanks a lot for the greatly valuable information that we learned. Two quick questions. First question is to Mr. Shawan. You really touched the wound in with regard to our Palestinian reality and what's happening, and especially in economics and natural resources. However, you said something that is quite uh, um, interesting when you were talking about Al Haq's work, about point 1A and point B, Geneva Convention or other human rights conventions. Did your organization really have an influence on political parties in Palestine? And does Al Haq organization and other Palestinian human rights organizations play a prominent role on international human rights levels and forums? Second question to Mrs. Sahar, with regard to the violence in prisons, did you only mean court torture, physical crime, or violence, or also the psychological violence? Which one did you mean? And that's because we have worked with released prisoners and especially children and those who serve for a long time. We have seen that we need whole organizations to rehabilitate the prisoners after they have been released. They suffer from severe psychological disorders. It's like almost no one leaves the prison in this as the same person as they were before going to prison. It seems like they change 180 degrees. So how can human rights organizations which are keen on Palestinian prisoners work in order to benefit this aspect? Up until this session, the speakers were not mentioning that there are other tools, as for example, the UN conventions tools and so on. That is a lever, a real pushing tool, if you may. The legal stipulations and provisions can really help. However, yeah, we have seen how there is a great hallucination, as if in with regard to such certain subjects. Um, People many times do not understand that there are other tools and other means that can help in bringing better results from these laws on the state level, even. One more comment with regard to the Oslo Accords. As mentioned previously, Oslo did not tackle human rights or did not even mention it. And in the Palestinian Information Center for Human Rights, they spoke with Amnesty International and they met with us and Al Haq organization, and we saw that Oslo did not have anything related to human rights or any mention. And then they met with the president of the Palestinian authority, and afterwards they established the Human Rights Commission for in Palestine. So, apart from the subject of settlements, Jerusalem, and refugees, the subject has not been taken into consideration. Thanks a lot, Mr. Mahmoud. Then the other speakers. I would like to distinguish between the defeat of Zionism from one side and the victory of Palestine and or the liberation of Palestine. Uh, we can say necessary and sufficient condition is the main condition for the liberation of Palestine, meaning the defeat of Zionism is the main condition for the liberation of Palestine. Zionism must be defeated. The second point or comment is that based on my experience in defending human rights from Zionism for many years, we have seen that this is a great necessity. There should be the delegitimization of Israel and the removal of its fake cover for of pretending to be countries that promote human rights. This is very important. Why? Because in the United Nations, for example, if they specify Israel as an apartheid state in the General Assembly of the UN, can easily succeed before because Palestine has a crystal clear support in the UN General Assembly, and therefore I am quite sure that the UN General Assembly would support Palestine, and through organizations like Al Haq, there can be work towards promoting the punishment of Israel for apartheid. That could be a great achievement. It would not necessarily liberate Palestine, but it would harm the image of Israel as an apartheid state, because this is the case. And so Zionism should be defeated, and there are ways to do it, and it is inevitable. My question is to Mr. Sha'wan Jabarin first and foremost, and if anyone else wants to comment on it, it's fine. From what I understood from Mr. Sha'wan, because we do not have a state, or we have a semi-state or a state under occupation, then the economic and social rights cannot be upheld. And because there are limited authorities under us, and we do not have natural resources, and we have a limited budget, then we are incapable of upholding economic and social rights. For this purpose, or from this reason, or for this reason, this could be a pretext for not applying or adhering to economic, social, and cultural rights. In the last 2 days, we have understood quite well that there are natural rights that people cannot live without, meaning that everyone has the responsibility to preserve the rights. How the PA practices the authorities of a state, even though, or despite the fact that they are a semi-state. Do you have a certain question, sir? My question is as follows. If I understood Mr. Sha'wan, is that he saw things as such that we cannot be liberated or saved from the occupation except with enabling and empowering people to practice their humanity and resist the occupation. Therefore, we shouldn't only blame the Israeli side. Otherwise, the PA might have to leave in order to have our resistance and the defiance of the occupation be directly. Otherwise, our confrontation would be with the PA as the face of that colonization. Mr. Samir, and then later, yeah, the other speakers, oh, and Madam here. Question to Mr. Fatah and Ammar, and then to Sahar. Why are the rights of the Palestinian people linked to the independence in 1967 areas? Why do they allow the occupation to do all its violations? And then the PA comes and claims to be a resistance movement, throws a couple rockets, and all the people's rights are then abused. We have the BDS and armed struggle. So, of course, this is the armed resistance is a legitimate thing according to the international law. So equality should also be promoted. Neither Palestinians nor Israelis will leave this country. Therefore, we need a strong vision, a vision in the policies of the occupation. That's how things can change. What do you think about this? And then a question to Professor Sahar Francis. You were talking about the prisons of the occupation. What are the things that the PA prisons learned from the Israeli prisons? What practices are used in Palestinian prisons which are also present in Israeli prisons? Thank you. Thanks. Thanks for cooperating. We cannot hear. Please activate the microphone. Yeah. I was expecting that Mr. Fatah, during his talk about binaries, that he would discuss the main binary, which is occupation and the of Palestinian Authority. Both of them are there together on the ground. So how can we manage the issue of human rights, including the economic and social rights, within this binary, the binary of occupation vs PA? So I think that some of the subjects have to do with the Israeli violations only as a small part, and then they deal with the PA as a separate file. However, most of the reports show or talk about the Israeli violations against the PA and the Palestinian people. So how can we specify the borders of authorities of each side and the rights of the people under occupation, regardless of whether there is a Palestinian Authority or not? Oslo did not say that the occupation will end. However, Oslo has a very clear article which specifies the responsibility of both parties. That our article says that both parties agree that the responsibilities and authorities would be moved from the Israeli military to the Palestinian Authority. and these responsibilities and authorities shall be passed in a gradual manner. This is what Oslo says. Therefore, this article specified what was given to the PA and what was practiced by the PA. Therefore, this article gave the PA the responsibility to tackle the economic and social matters. Um, however, Israel did not pass all these authorities to the PA, such as the natural resources. Hence, the Israeli side is still in charge of main rights of Palestinians since we are still under the occupation. Hence, uh, we are still within the responsibility of the Israeli occupation. The main problematic thing came when there was the internal Palestinian division, when we came to have two Palestinian authorities, PA and Hamas. And that means that whoever has the authority became the responsible party. That further complicated the situation and the obligations. Hence, we can use the Oslo article, which spoke about that. And there are many things from Oslo, by the way, which were not transitioned or given by Israel, since it violated that accord as well. But so I think that the PA did not change the authorities in its hands. It did not really have the authorities that were specified in Oslo. Hence, the authorities must be crystal clear. Sometimes in the PA, they try to tell you, you're focusing on us, we are under the occupation, go to Israel. It is true that the occupation has some responsibilities, and especially in the things that were not passed to the PA, such as the land, water, energy, and other things that are still in the hands of the Israelis. So, the borders and passages, commerce, many other things that are still in the hands of the Israelis, and at the same time, the Palestinian Authority did receive some authorities that it must be held accountable for. Hence, we must hold both sides accountable, the Israeli and the PA sides. We will take 2 or 3 questions. We should finish soon. I just received information that there is an activity which will go on here at 5:30. That's why we will not prolong too much. Good afternoon. First of all, thanks a lot for your tremendous efforts in this conference. Question to Mr. Fateh Azab. You were talking about the international humanitarian law. We all know that this law is a colonizing law. The countries that were that were in charge put this law in order to silence the indigenous peoples. So when we talk about Israel and the PA or the Palestinians, um what what do you think is the gap which will be created if the authority really passes or fully passes from Israel to the PA? Also, let us consider that the Human Rights Commission. What is the difference? Give me the one achievement that the Human Rights Commission has achieved. The Palestinian Human Rights Commission. Dr. Ammar Dweik, you did not answer me on one question that I have. Does the international law lead to results or not? Why didn't you answer me? Because you said that it has advantages and disadvantages. It is with us or against us. Can you please answer that question to Professor Sahar? Of course, the prisoner movement has not received enough support from the Palestinian people, and even in Oslo, and then. So my question to you is, what is the mobilization of the PA on the global level to promote the cause of the prisoners? And the question to Mr. Shawan, uh, many times I regret reading a lot about different issues and publications and books. I get really provoked by many pieces of news in Al Quds University. It is quite clear that we as a people are paying the price of the occupation. It seems that we keep doing that. I want to speak in a nutshell. Do you have any question? I did ask my question. I was just giving an introduction before the question. Please, we must finish soon. If you may, can you please just say two sentences? 1.5 minutes, okay? We have paid the price, the invoice, if you may, of the occupation. So, why shouldn't we receive an allowance for the human resource, for the natural resources? We have a right on the natural resources that Israel is enjoying because we were kicked as outside our country or to other areas. Another thing is that is the GEC, and Palestine must benefit from it. The GEC emerged from the Paris Protocol. The GEC says that the Palestinian Commission must sit with the Israeli Commission. Israel did implement everything good from Oslo, but there were good things in Oslo that we should have benefited. This is like someone who just recently married, but if he received any kids, he didn't look after them. This is the parable. Okay, one last point. I think that some Palestinian companies should be insured, such as the Palestinian telecommunications company Paltel. The Palestinian state must establish an insurance company that can promote companies, and I think that the Palestinian budget needs modification as well. Thank you. Oh, thanks a lot. You were asking something? I am sorry. Okay, please go ahead. Quick question to Dr. Sha'wan Jabarin with regard to the Palestinian law and the private companies. In Expotech 2018, they were talking about the violations. Someone from the private sector came then during Expotech and was saying that we are with the freedom of expression. He was talking as a general person, an owner of a company. And there was mobilization on this level. The Palestinian investment law in Article 27 says that, quote unquote, it is the obligation of the PA to give the private sector the necessary suitable environment to do whatever they want. That's what the law says. So, what are the mechanisms of this Palestinian law in order to defend against the violations? What are the mechanisms for defense against the violations of private companies? There is a great mobilization on this. This is a great issue. This was my question. Yeah, many times they just answer yes, yes, yes when there is not enough time. 3 minutes for each speaker, if you may, to comment on the questions. Mr. Fateh, right to left. Yes.
Thank you, everybody, for the interventions. I will try to rebut where there were like bullet points, in a very quick way. I just opened it. In this phase, it is the most exciting, but time is lacking. For Basim, the recipes for success is whether it is human rights or an economic or different. You should have a clear vision of where you're heading, but you should always have knowledge and the information. You cannot want to make an achievement in human rights as Sha'wan to speak about rosy picture and high romanticism and how to use it, the timing, the detail requires efficiency and performance. You need people who take it professionally and not in sloganeering. You could go to the street and so on. Either you do that or nothing. To do it efficiently, regardless of where you're heading or what you're trying to do. I did not get grasp the question properly, maybe. It's not a question of 67 line, but the geographic distribution that it is open in a certain direction and closed in another direction to deal with a specific legal status. Just as Israel do not allow Palestinians to go with the superior court, so Israel's law, what is applicable there, and who has the authority to defend there. I am with it to say in a comprehensive way and to look at it as a series of battles that we engage in various forms and various tools where we see it as a comprehensive and efforts. I don't see a contradiction there. However, we need to be accurate in how to deliver the work by a clear strategic outlook. Azmi, I agree with you. Part of the problematic is that what Oslo has given us, it is the division of responsibility between Israel and the PA. The actual mandate is a term used, for example, in education in Jerusalem is not part of Oslo, but there is a norm that the system goes to the Minister of Education, they approve the curricula, and it goes to Israel. Now Israel is shuffling the cards, and where there is an actual division of the responsibility in the school curriculum, there is this kind of functional division has to do with the three areas, A, B, and C. So there are also divergences about the mandate in that area. شو بدك فيهم يا سلامي؟
بس هون بدك تفوت على مش بس على الماده هذه عامه وتدخل بالتدريس صح؟ بدك تفوت طب امتى نقلت هذه الصلاحيه؟
So when this mandate has been transferred and you have to specify it and interact, where one of the most important tools of human rights, anyone that has a responsibility, if they have a company or a factory It's like the father that he has the responsibility not to spank his wife or children. Spank. The last point concerning Samir, we want to deal with clarity. Also, to use terminology. When you say IHL, you're speaking about Geneva Conventions, not the human rights international. Sometimes these concepts are 58 countries have accepted the World Declaration. It is the father, as we say, it's the offshoot, but there were 148 countries when they started the two eras where the conventions were legally binding. In 1977, there were 148 members. 24 countries have accepted on the text. We should not keep referring to the credibility of the Universal Declaration that only 58 countries were part of the UN, which is 1 year after the partition plan. Thanks on the questions and the people who have stayed until the end. I will try to answer, but I don't have the time to clarify more. That there are two aspects, objective or procedural aspects. So what are the pros and the cons? In the objective sector, that we could raise questions about self-determination dimensions, two countries and the legitimacy of settlement. This is given. It's basic. There were a number of the procedural aspects, which is the second part of the issue, where to take a decision to being recognized, or 2334 about the settlement that the UN Secretary General should present to the Security Council about the situation of UN. This was not pursued. Parents' state obligation is also where so that they don't give legal for the illegal steps like Jerusalem or settlement and so on. This is negative, but there is positive dimensions where the special rapporteur in Amman, we require that the future report will focus on that. What are the obligations of other countries concerning like companies, boycott, and the attitude to settlements? What Bassem has said, that the countries that were emancipated from colonization, nobody has defeated them militarily, the colonization. But at the end of the day, that the colonizer will reach a conclusion because they cannot continue. Almost the military thing was in shambles in Algeria. But the colonizing, the people that have the upper hand, they decide. So you have to remove legitimacy from Israel. This is why attacking Chapter 7 and Item 7, and this could remove the legitimacy of Israel. It could undermine it, and also a step to activate the international community that will implement the international entry. And so what is the best example that do we want actually to request that this apartheid must come to an end so that there is equality among people. the various protagonists.
بدك إنه نصدر مع بعض تفصلهم عن بعض
You have to separate the different elements each from other.
حدد شو اللي بدك إياه
You have to specify.
الضفة الغربية بتاع
And
غزة
if you have self-determination
40 وبالتالي تعيد
for
مرة
West Bank
كله
and to
أنت مشكلتك
review the whole
تسوي
partition
لها
plan,
يعني
is your problem with Israel, or you don't mind having
لأنه كل
a
واحد
state?
يتقدم عليها نتائج عملية
Because every option
إحنا مشكلتنا ما في
has
يعني
legal
جنوب أفريقيا يقول
and political ramification.
هذا مطلبه
Algeria, the request was clear: one man, one vote.
إحنا نطلب الفلسطيني تأرتكلت مثلا نقول إنه أنت بتنهي الصهيونية
In our situation,
أنا بدي دولة بالضفة
to finish Zionism.
واحد ثاني بقول لك أنا بدي دولة
And
حكم السيادة
third thing, I need one state
كفرت
to collective equality
معارضة كل سوا مع اليهود يستقل المصير
in self-determination. These things we have to
اختاروا قانون دولي
determine
ممكن يفيدنا جدا كفلسطين
and to
حتى
use
التنسيق الأمني
that even in security coordination.
التنسيق الأمني
I wrote an article that
خلى عن التنسيق
the
جدا بسهولة
the PA want
إطار حقوق الإنسان
to get rid of this. Maybe they can use the human rights
دولة
alibi
حقوق الإنسان تستفيد من هذه
to
المعلومات
benefit from the information
صاحبه
that could lead to house demolition on information, or to torture, or send somebody to administrative detention. And when you say maybe the world will not oppose that, providing the information has grave consequences,
ممكن احنا نستخدم
we could use it as Palestinians in order to change the will of high contracting powers
والتركيز على الجانب الإجرائي
and to focus on the procedural aspects and remove legitimization against occupation. Over the issue of torture has two aspects, physical and psychological, but the definition is clear and concise in order to get confessions, how we get information. So the agreement of opposing, standing up to torture and not rehabilitation and assisting the detainees, which is a complex issue, multifaceted, where we discuss the role of Palestinian under the sponsorship after emancipation and the needs that surface. One of the purposes of settlement, it is destroying the structure of the society. Regarding the means are of course there are ways of torture that have to do with the Palestinian investigators who were with preventive security and intelligence. They were subject and they were not given remedies, and it is very easy that the underdog who has been tortured to become a torturer himself if they are not aware that this is a crime. So there was physical torture, very similar to Israeli forms of torture, and that have even developed further. So also you have manners like administrative detention that has no time limit. About the shortcomings of the detainees, my purpose is not to lay the blame on the thing what happens about the women detainees before of the about the fora that they are very alert to the cameras that is focusing on them, and from the and the shortcomings around the issue of it. But there was a short time and I could not elaborate over the issues of solidarity and interrelationship that has a form of struggle which is not necessarily legal, and international solidarity. In the 70s, that has transcended the local community and to be in solidarity with Irish, with the Basque, with Turks, uh, and to have much more activity. And now, as Fatih mentioned, the Damir Institute through popular agitation in America and the black Americans, and to have exchange and solidarity and cooperation between Palestinian detainees and other indigenous or non-indigenous detainees. Quickly, Al-Haq did have a certain impact, and it could have uh, outsourcing with other uh, human rights organizations in 2014, while we were pushing with Mahmoud Abbas that exchange of lands has implications. I will send you our study, and we sent him 7, 8 uh, books. Nothing happened. Then they mentioned that there will be a sort of exchange of land. No, I don't want to find justification for the PA, but I like to put where are the limits of the various relevant issues, and this has to do with the budget that you raised. Regardless, how is the division? Does it have to do with the political, economic, social rights, with the right of accommodation, health, education, to have all this package to take into consideration? Why you have 30% for security? Why such a huge percentage? That's something, if we speak as jurists all the time, according to the authority, the land is under occupation. And if I deal purely in an abstract way, that these are agents, mediators to the occupation, that's another issue. This is an abstract academic kind of aspect. Also, the cost to the occupation and the rights of refugees and relevant issues. And we discussed this, but this is a very complex issue. And UNCTAD at the UN, they try to work on this to make the occupation more costly. About the companies, I don't have. The private companies, if there are violations, they could look to personal rights to elaborate, the economic and social rights, that it has to do with the type of violation, and that the authority has not taken measures to stop such. So the special rapporteur could be a report or that institutions present over the violations in a formal way based on a certain convention. This is the issue that we interacted with it. Thank you. Thank you. Allow me at the end to thank a number of people that have contributed in different levels in organizing this. The cleaning team, the guards, the technical support from the computer, the IT, the engineering, and voice, the public relations, the photographers, the media to provide technical, and of course the volunteers, the translators who have done hard and special appreciation to the different activities, the photographer, the campaign to the right of entry, all the respect that without them there is no conference. Henrik Bell, Dr. Bettina, her team,
وليس آخر
Henrik Bull Foundation,
أمال
and Muwatin, Amal, Joyce, Fathi Noor.
قام عليه هذا المؤتمر. الشكر جزيل لهم ولكم جميعا.
Thank you to all of you
مؤتمر القادم.
and meet you in a future conference and sayonara.